The Chicago Bears plan on using Montez Sweat and some other defensive linemen in new ways this season to try and unlock a better pass rush out of the players currently under contract.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1, and you can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. On the show today, we'll look at what new defensive coordinator Eric Washington's plan is for this Chicago Bears defensive line. That includes using Montez Sweat in ways that he hasn't been really used before in his career to try and get more out of him now that he's actually been around the team for longer than just half of a season. We'll also look at some of the other players that will be deployed in different ways to try and get more out of this pass rush, but also leaving the door open for someone like Yannick Ngakoue to still be added on top of this. And we'll take a look at what the Bears will be looking for once the pads come on Friday to evaluate whether or not another addition on this defensive line is or is not needed at this stage. But I want to start with Montez Sweat because I think it's going to be the most different for him, and he's going to be really at the center of this plan, because he has spent his entire career playing essentially the same defensive end spot. You know, when the Bears traded for him halfway through last season, there wasn't a lot of time to do a lot of brand new stuff, right? It was like, okay, it's mid-season. We just got to get you up to speed enough to get you on the field. So we're going to play you at your familiar spot, ask you to do your familiar things, and just go. Just go get sacks and do it. So like we've seen throughout the season last year with the Bears and with the Commanders before that, like Montez Sweat almost exclusively lines up at that same defensive end spot, what we consider the left defensive end on defense, but primarily going up against the right tackle on offense. Occasionally, the Bears or the Commanders would have him play the other defensive end spot and swap to the other side. It's not like it's 100% over there, but the vast majority of the time, it's lined up outside of the right tackle, very occasionally outside of the left tackle, but that's pretty much it. Especially last season with the Bears, they really wanted to keep it simple. But now that Sweat has been with the team for not only like a half of a regular season, but a full offseason program and now the first training camp with the Chicago Bears, they finally have a little bit more time to say, okay, what else can we do here? How can we get more out of Montez Sweat and maybe ask him to do some things that he hasn't been asked to do before, but can help this defensive line be at its absolute best. So it sounds like, based on what we heard from defensive coordinator Eric Washington on Tuesday, that's going to mean kicking him inside to some defensive tackle snaps and getting other defensive ends on the field on the edge and having Sweat be one of those guys that kicks inside specifically on passing downs. Here's how the new defensive coordinator Eric Washington described it without trying to give away too many details.
What are the main differences of things that he's doing now that he hasn't been asked to do previously?
Well, without getting into to specifics as far as scheme is concerned, we want to have flexibility. I'll say this: we want flexibility with where we can align him, and we want to utilize his skill set against the offensive line and not just specific to one position. And so,
Gotcha.
So I like first of all, I really appreciate the fact that he's embracing that challenge and just everything that he's doing to just make his game as well-rounded as possible.
One of the other things Washington said around that was, like, before that he was asked, like, what has surprised him the most, or what has he learned about Montez Sweat since he got to Chicago, since Washington got to Chicago. And he said he was impressed with just how strong Sweat is. Like, he knew he was strong, but he was even stronger than he had realized until he got to, like, coach him up close and personal. And I think that's a pretty good indicator of, like, why they see him as more viable to play some inside snaps. Again, like specifically in passing down situations. You're not going to see it be third and short and the Bears move Sweat inside a defensive tackle. Like, this is a strategy of getting your best pass rushers on the field. Sweat is listed at like 6'6", 260/265 in that kind of range. So he doesn't have the bulk of a true defensive tackle, right? You're not going to ask Montez Sweat to hold up against a double team on the interior to try and stop the running game. That's not the point here. The point is to say, okay, ideally, you don't need, if you know, or you're very sure, pretty darn sure that the offense is going to pass in a certain situation, second or third and long type of situations, then you don't really need to have a nose tackle on the field, right? Like the nose tackle is not a pass rushing position per se. It's not a player you rely on to be a consistent pass rusher. So you would rather have your 4 best pass rushing defensive linemen on the field there. And as the Bears depth chart and defensive line stands right now, I mean, you've got, Sweat, Dexter, Billings, and Walker are normally your starters. Billings is not going to be one of your 4 best pass rushers, so you could take him out, and you could put in Zach Pickens or another defensive tackle, or you could take someone like Montez Sweat and move him to defensive tackle, and then bring another defensive end like Austin Booker or Jake Martin or Dominique Robinson on the field, and then have more of a pass rush there. But Sweat doesn't have to be the only one that you kick inside there. I mean, of course, the Bears have already experimented that with some other players in years past, and I think Sweat is not the only part of this plan, as guys that we haven't seen play much defensive tackle or kick inside on passing downs. Like, I think the Bears are going to do that with a few other players. We're already seeing some of that at training camp, just to try and get a sense of like, okay, who can handle those types of snaps? Who can they rely on to say, yeah, if we're kicking you in a defensive tackle, you're going up against guards who are definitely going to be slower than the offensive tackles you've been going up against, but are probably going to be stronger and a little bit harder to say, bull rush. They're going to be anchored a little better. You as an interior rusher in these situations are going to have less space to work in. It's tighter windows. You're going to face probably some more double teams because the center's right there to help, more often. It's a different style of pass rushing, and certainly a different style of pass protecting for you to have to account for. And so, like, training camp is the real opportunity to try this out. And I think there's a pretty strong faith in Sweat being able to handle this. That one's not so much like, can he or can he not do it? But I think there's some other guys that they're experimenting with on the inside that's more of a, let's see how they do it in training camp before we deploy them and rely on them fully during like regular season type snaps. But I think if executed correctly, moving these players around in this way can be a really effective tool for not only getting your best pass rushers on the field, but also making life more difficult for offensive linemen to have to account for your defensive line in a lot of different ways. So we'll kind of look at some of the possibilities here and some of the other guys who are also kicking inside that haven't really necessarily done that before. Next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Gametime, the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. I have the Gametime app on my phone, and I use it all the time. I just used it last week on Monday. I went to a concert at Wrigley Field. It was Steve Miller Band, Journey, and Def Leppard, one after the other. It was a little condensed because of the rainstorm that had been coming in, but it was a great show. And I loved getting my tickets on Gametime because I could see exactly what my view was going to be from the bleachers in Wrigley Field. So I knew exactly what I was getting with my ticket. And I also knew exactly how much I was paying for my ticket because Gametime has all-in pricing. So you know upfront what your ticket's going to cost. And there aren't going to be any of those added fees that pop up during the checkout that make your tickets cost way more than you thought they would. So that's where this app is so helpful for me and why I use it all the time. Like they say, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. This Bears defensive line needs to get creative to generate a more consistent pass rush as it stands right now. The roster has a lot of unproven players in terms of pass rushing consistency, and in order to maximize them, being able to utilize some versatility and moving guys around is going to go a long way. And it's not just going to be Montez Sweat kicking inside. Certainly, we saw last season a bit more, and even more before that in Tennessee. DeMarcus Walker has that built-in versatile skill set and experience to be an interior pass rusher a lot and to be an edge guy. Like, he can do both at a pretty high level, not a Pro Bowl level, but a pretty high level. A guy who's had 7 sack seasons before, and a lot of that comes inside, honestly, is where he's able to, offer some different tools and skill sets that opposing offensive linemen, aren't always ready for when you're trying to keep tabs on where he's lining up. Is he on the edges, on the interior? How are you adjusting your pass protection plan from that? Like, that's really what's going to be so special with Montez Sweat, because we know wherever Montez Sweat is on the defensive line, the opposing offensive line is generally going to structure their pass protection around, hey, he is the primary threat. We need to make sure we've got eyes and hands on him at all times. So when you're used to him playing left defensive end across from the right tackle, the vast majority of the time, teams go into games thinking, okay, we're going to slide a lot of our protections that way, or we're going to leave the tight end to help on his side, or the running back is going to help on his side, or whatever combination or game plan they want to put together. But if on the next play, Montez Sweat comes in lined up over the left guard instead of the right tackle, okay, now all of a sudden you have to shift your protection and help out more on the interior there. That leaves less help then on the edges for your offensive tackle, so that if you bring in, DeMarcus Walker on one side and say your rookie 5th-round pick Austin Booker on the other side, they're going to have easier matchups there. And it's this balance of like, okay, you want to use Sweat to create easier matchups for other players. You also want to put Sweat in positions where he has the best matchup or can do the most damage. And certainly pass rushing on the interior is a shorter pathway to the quarterback if he can, do that well and consistently. But he just hasn't been asked to do that very much up to this point in his career. Like, we'll look back at last season, but these numbers tend to be pretty reflective of his entire career up to this point. Like, on this Bears defense, and actually, no, this includes his time in Washington. This is the full season, not just the half season last season. For Montez Sweat's full 2023 season, he played on the edge 98.4% of his snaps. Like, anything interior was 1.6% of his snaps. And it's not as simple as like true edge versus true defensive tackle. Like, I'm going to oversimplify it here as sort of like inside versus outside. There's some spots like, like a 4-eye technique or a 5 technique sometimes that are kind of borderline, whether you call it inside or outside. And it's not worth kind of getting into the weeds there on what this means, but it's simple. It's maybe a slight oversimplification, but it gets the point across. Sweat was on the outside 98.4% of the time last season. Based on what we heard from Eric Washington there, definitely planning on decreasing that number and making him more of an interior player. Now, that does not mean 50-50. I don't think that means even 60-40. I don't think it even means 70-30. Like, it's not going to be like he is a part-time defensive tackle. It's going to be key pass rushing situations. I think in the past, I remember the 2010s New York Giants defense. It was like their NASCAR package, right? With Justin Tuck and Michael Strahan and OCU Minora and somebody else there, where they'd get 4 defensive ends on the field and get after the quarterback. Like, the Bears might not go that extreme because you might want Javon Dexter on the field or Zach Pickens or some other guys, but that idea, right? Where he might play 10% of his snaps at defensive tackle and 90% on the edge, right? Like, that kind of split, which is still 10 times more than what he did last season. It's still a big change, but it's not like it's a completely brand new position that he's going to play that's going to take him off the edge the majority of the time. Absolutely not. Where comparatively last season, DeMarcus Walker played about a third inside and 2/3 on the edge, like a 66-34 split there. I don't even think we're going to see Montez Sweat approach that number. Walker is going to be around that number. I think we're going to see DeMarcus Walker be closer to that 2/3 edge, 1/3 defensive tackle, maybe even higher. That could even go 60-40, depending on how the defensive end depth plays out over the course of the season. But that, I think, is going to be part of this plan. And health will make a difference there too. But I think he's going to be the one who's still your primary defensive end who kicks inside. The first one who's going to do that is DeMarcus Walker. The majority of anytime you're going to do that, majority of that time, it's going to be Walker being the one who kicks in. But at training camp practices already, we have seen Dominique Robinson also kick inside to defensive tackle, which is interesting based on what we know about Dominique as a football player, right? He has put on weight and strength and pounds since he came into the NFL with the Chicago Bears as a 5th-round pick in 2022. But we knew him to be a former quarterback turned wide receiver turned defensive end, right? Quarterbacks and wide receivers do not have the types of bodies that can hold up and rush the passer at the defensive tackle position. And he's still generally a, longer, leaner type of defensive end. You're not going to mistake his body for DeMarcus Walker's body, who's a little bit, thicker and more of a stouter defensive end. But, Robinson's got good length like Montez Sweat does, and a lot of interior offensive linemen tend to have the shorter arms. And so that's where those guys can find those more advantageous matchups where you're going against a slower offensive lineman with shorter arms. Like, you might have less space to work with left and right as a pass rusher, but you're gonna have better leverage on him with your arm length. Like, you're gonna get your hands on him first, and you're gonna be faster than him and more explosive than him. And there's an ability there for that to be a mismatch in its own way. I'm less confident in Dominique Robinson being able to hold up consistently enough as an interior pass rusher, just because we haven't seen him really fully put it all together as an edge guy. And so, like, if you haven't put it all together at one spot, that's more of the natural spot you've been working at, are you going to all of a sudden put it all together at a brand new spot that's a little bit less natural for you, even less natural than the other spot you've been trying to learn? Like, I'm glad that they're trying it with him because, again, much like Montez Sweat, he was like 98% edge rusher. Very rarely did he ever kick inside in the past couple of seasons. But it's worth, at training camp, seeing how it goes. What does it look like when he's out there? And maybe it's a more natural fit for him in some of those situations because he can use that length. And maybe he doesn't feel like he needs the kind of space on the edge. He can win in more of these compact, tight windows. So I'm glad they're trying it with him. I'm less optimistic that that'll be a big role for him this season. Like, I think it'll be more Walker and Sweat that kick inside, and you leave Robinson and Jacob Martin and Austin Booker to be the fill-in edge rushers in those types of situations. Heck, I mean, you could even move Gervon Dexter to the edge sometimes if you just want to throw different things at the opposing offensive line to kind of keep track of why that huge guy is over there. They did that with Justin Jones last season a fair number of times, so it's a real possibility for Gervon Dexter to get some of that too. But clearly, like, last season and throughout these guys' career, everyone but DeMarcus Walker has played almost 100% of their snaps on the edge, and only very, very rarely did they ever shift inside for any reason. The plan this season is to have them play more on the inside than they have at any point previous in their career, and it's up to Eric Washington and Matt Eberflus and company to figure out, like, what the right amount is there and how they can use that best to their advantage. Because, maybe you put Sweat at defensive tackle and then you have him stunt to the outside, and so he's still going up against the offensive tackle, but the offensive line had shifted their protection more to stop him on the interior, right? Like, there's a lot of different things you can do when you move these guys around, and I'm glad they're giving that a try as they try and evaluate, do they still need to add to this pass rush? Is someone like Yannick Ngakoue still going to be a potential missing piece here? I don't think that's been answered yet, and it won't be answered the first day the Bears put on the pads on Friday, but I do think we have a better sense of what they're going to be looking for now, what kind of the key answer is going to be for them to say, yes, we need to sign this player, or no, we're good with the guys that we have. So we'll kind of take a look at who's going to be under the microscope as the Bears make this free agency evaluation next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is sponsored by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience are the formula for winning championships, but it's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. We're talking superchargers, exhaust kits, LED headlights, roof racks, and more. So whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your vehicle, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. The Bears haven't been able to fully evaluate this defensive line yet. They've gotten a good sense of where some guys have made some progress. They're able to measure a lot of the intangible stuff and the energy and the motor and the bodies and the physical tools and such. But until those pads go on, the Bears don't have a complete picture of the quality of their defensive line and the amount of progress some of these guys have made. And so I think that's the biggest reason why we keep hearing the flirting with a veteran free agent like Yannick Ngakoue, but they haven't pulled the trigger just yet. I thought they might just do it at the start of training camp. Clearly, they still want to get a look at these guys, but the pads will go on Friday for the first time. And that changes everything for this defensive line and for the offensive line. I'm not going to play the audio because I want to hear from Eric Washington instead, but Andrew Billings had said, when the pads go on, that's when you can put your helmet in guys' chest, right? There's a physicality that comes with that where you just can't really truly operate in exactly the same way as it is on a game day. And so you can't really tell for sure how well the offensive or defensive lines are doing in the situations or the types of tools and skill sets that are most replicable to value on game day. And so one day of padded practice on Friday is not going to be enough. But I think you go, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then into early next week, you get 2 or 3 or 4 padded practice days under their belt. Then I think they'll have a little bit of a better sense of okay, what does Gervon Dexter's actual pad level look like? What is his hand placement really looking like? How is this translating against real pass rushing situations? How much better is a fully healthy DeMarcus Walker, who said he was about 75% for the majority of last season until kind of late on in the process? How good does he look? Does he look like he can be the type of starting defensive end that you need opposite Montez Sweat? But I think the evaluation on whether or not the Bears want to sign someone like Yannick Ngakoue still is not about your starters, but it's about the other guys on this depth chart. It's about how good are Dominique Robinson, Austin Booker, and Jacob Martin, the free agent they signed from the Indianapolis Colts. I think the Bears already have a pretty good sense of they know how good Montez Sweat is. I think they know generally what DeMarcus Walker is and isn't capable of. They know generally his floor and his general type of ceiling. I think they know what he is. But the idea with this versatility strategy is that, okay, Sweat and Walker can both kick inside at various times, and that means you get another defensive end on the field. How good is that number 3 defensive end? And how good is that number 4 defensive end? How good those guys are is what's going to determine whether or not they sign Yannick Ngakoue. Because if you sign Yannick Ngakoue, he becomes the starter opposite Sweat. You move DeMarcus Walker to be your number 3 defensive end / defensive tackle. And then, Robinson and Booker and Martin are competing for number 4. But if at training camp here, Booker looks great, Jacob Martin looks like a starting caliber player, and Dominique Robinson takes a step forward, then you say, you know what? Okay, we've got 3 or 4 defensive ends that we like that we can get on the field by kicking these guys to the interior. But if you're kicking Sweat and Walker on the interior and the guys you're bringing on aren't any good, then that's when you really need Yannick Ngakoue. The kicking into the interior thing is a great way to get better pass rushers on the field, but you need to have better pass rushers to get on the field. And so, if you were to sign someone like Yannick Ngakoue, then, you can kick Walker inside and still have Sweat and Ngakoue on the field. Or if you kick Sweat inside, you could have Ngakoue and Walker on the edge. You know what I mean? But you need to be able to trust that number 3 or number 4 defensive ends that you rotate in here. So here's Bears defensive coordinator Eric Washington talking about how he's evaluating and what he's seeing from Austin Booker and Jacob Martin in particular being the new faces to this defensive line.
Any early impressions? I know it's early, obviously, really, but anything worth mentioning as far regarding Booker, what he's done?
Yeah, there's a lot of positives. Yesterday was really the first day that we could kind of turn up the pass rush a little bit because we've been kind of working the tempo, if you will. And not that, we're not in pads yet, but I saw a lot of things that I'm really excited about. His hand usage, his ability to counter, and with a pass rusher, especially a young player, just a mindset. He's competing out there, and he's competing to win. He's got one objective in mind, and that's to put himself in position to hit the quarterback. So I'm really excited to see that.
Is Jacob Martin going full speed because he played in a similar scheme with Lovey previously in Houston, and how do you evaluate him?
Jacob, great speed and quickness, very athletic. He's an excellent space player, but he's really sturdy at the point of attack. And so those types of things you really need to have. So, I mean, we can anticipate his role being as a 3-down defender. So far as a right defensive end, he's doing a nice job. He has and then the other thing with him, Brad, is just the way that he comes out early to practice every day by himself, and he just starts to mentally tune himself up to go out and put forth the kind of practice he wants to have, to establish himself as the kind of rusher we need him to be.
I do think Washington and the Bears generally project Jacob Martin to be your number 3 defensive end this season, because that's basically what he was last season with the Indianapolis Colts. And prior to that, he had played in Lovie Smith's defense with the Houston Texans, which is going to be a similar scheme to what the Bears are running this year. And also, he was a starter for a full season for them in 2021, and definitely has like a lot more career sacks and consistent production throughout his career than Dominique Robinson or Austin Booker. I think it's Jacob Martin is going to be the 3rd defensive end, and then it's really a competition between Austin Booker and Dominique Robinson for that kind of 4th defensive end spot. You also have Khalid Kareem, who they brought in from the Colts last season, was one of Jake Martin's teammates, I believe, at least for training camp last season. And those guys are all going to be competing for your top 6 defensive end spots, and they probably end up keeping 5 at most, and maybe even 4. Like, you could see it being Sweat, Walker, Martin, Booker, and Robinson's cut, and Khalid Kareem's cut, and they're on their way out. Maybe you want to keep 5 if you're going to be rotating Walker and Sweat in a defensive tackle so much that, maybe you only keep 3 or 4 defensive tackles, but Walker kind of plays a lot of defensive tackle, so then you keep 5 defensive ends to make sure that you've got extra defensive end depth available there. But if you added someone like Yannick Ngakoue to that mix, then that takes another roster spot away from one of those other defensive ends, and maybe then it's only Sweat, Ngakoue, Booker, and Jacob Martin, and then Dominique Robinson is on his way out there as well. The reason I keep saying it's far from too late to sign Yannick Ngakoue is something to keep in mind here. Last year, the Bears signed Yannick Ngakoue on August 4th. So we're still not quite 2 weeks away from that. I'm not good at calendar math, but we still got quite some time here. I guess less than 2 weeks away from that, but like that would be the first Sunday in August this year. So, a week and a half away from the date last year that they signed Yannick Ngakoue. So it's not as though he has missed too much time. Like, yes, the Bears started earlier this year, and if he signs on August 4th, I think you're missing the Hall of Fame game at that point. But like, he's a veteran who was literally in this defense last season. It's not like Ngakoue needs to get here and learn a brand new scheme or brand new terminology or anything. So there is still plenty of time for them to wait, go through the padded practices, go through a full week of padded practices. I mean, literally, when you look at the calendar, they could do almost a full week of padded practices, or a little over a full week of padded practices, and still sign Yannick Ngakoue earlier this year than they did last season, as far as the run up to the regular season. So still time and nothing ruled out just yet. I'm not, at this point, I think they're legitimately leaving it as an open question and not sure whether they want to or not. Ngakoue worked out for the Dolphins. They signed Emmanuel Ogbah instead, but that took another defensive end off of the market for the Bears to be able to pick from here. So I do think it's probably still Ngakoue or bust, and I do think they're legitimately going to evaluate how this goes in pads. I think in the back of Ryan Poles' mind, he has a pretty good idea one way or the other. In the back of his head, he's either thinking, yeah, we're probably going to sign Ngakoue, but I just want to see them in the pads for sure first before I pull the trigger there, but probably still going to pull the trigger there. Or in the back of his mind, he goes, I really don't think we need Yannick Ngakoue. So let's see them in paths just to make sure, but I really think we're sitting pretty here and we don't need to go out and sign him, but it's nice to have that in our back pocket. Like, I think he has a strong inclination one way or the other, but wants to see them in pads first just to be 100% sure before he kind of locks in his decision of either we sign him or we don't. But I think we'll kind of know within the next week or so after a couple of days of padded practices, either they'll go out and bring him in right away or they won't, and they'll ride it out for a while, and then I think the only way they bring someone in is if there's an injury or something down the line. But if we get through a week of padded practices and the Bears don't make any changes on the defensive line, then I think they're sitting pretty and riding this group for whatever they're going to be able to squeeze out of the young players up front. Certainly when we get some padded practices here to dive into and we see some real progress from this defensive line, you can be sure we'll break it down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure that you hit the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day. If you're looking for your second listen, we've got Locked On Podcast Network podcasts for all of your favorite sports teams across NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL, and college sports. So go check out whether it's another Chicago sports team or you have fandoms in other cities. I don't judge, especially if they're in other sports. As long as you tune into Locked On Bears, go check out some of those other Locked On Sports podcasts. And then come on back tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Bears and another opportunity for you to bear down.